Parham, welcome. I want you to begin, if you would, by just giving us a little bit of background about yourself and your interest in artificial intelligence, and your background again focused on its implications, in particular from the human energy perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. So my background is in computer science and cognitive science. I started doing undergraduate research at Berkeley at various labs. I was at Redwood Center for neuroscience at Berkeley. I was doing some research there with neural networks, deep learning, specifically catastrophic forgetting in deep learning models. So there, I got to delve deeply into the nuances of these networks and how they work. And of course, I'm interested in sort of more semiotic approaches to technology and language inspired by Terry Deacon here. And yeah, my interest in the noosphere, of course, inspired me, and my work with human energy inspired me to kind of go a little beyond the technicality of these networks and sort of go beyond the question of whether they're intelligent or not, which seems to be the main topic now, which people discuss. My work with human energy inspired me to maybe investigate whether these large language models are doing something for our collective culture. Are they playing an organic role, not at their scale, but at the scale of society? That was inspiration for me to kind of research this new way of looking at AI.
Let's start with that question then. The way these systems work, um, uh, is it similar or different than the way we think and process information? And in what sense are they the same and different from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question because I think whenever people talk about intelligence, it's always used. First of all, it's always used in a behaviorist way. If it behaves a certain way, then it must be intelligent. I believe there are certain principles that enable intelligence. And I believe what these systems are doing, they contain an aspect of what an intelligent system, what an actual intelligent system does, which is basically this sort of behaviorism, input output simulation of intelligence. And I think that is part of what enables intelligence, but it's not the whole thing. So, yeah, that's how I think. That's how I think about what they're doing. It's tuning internal parameters based on inputs in a compressed space, and then being decompressed when they're inputted. And so there, it has this logic of this black box logic that we see in behaviors frameworks. And so that the insight that I hope to bring is that it would be dismissive to say that is not part of an organic process, right? So I think what we get wrong usually is the scale, right? If we see that there is this process which is tuning internal parameters based on inputs, it would be dismissive to say that's not organic. That's not doing anything that's part of any intelligent process. It is, but it's not intelligent itself. I think that's why the question of scale is important. At what scale is it aiding intelligence? Which I think now it's doing that at the cultural scale.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. So, given the differences um, and the way that AIs do things differently, whether you want to think about it, processing information, generating new information, generating new combinations of known information. Um, how is that going to work with people? In other words, considering the differences and similarities, um, what does that mean about the way they interact with people and how that's going to affect us? individually in the future?
Right. Great question. I think the the mistake that we usually make is that we think, if you go down the path of saying that these systems are actually intelligent, and if you treat them as chatbots, this sort of intelligent oracle that you get answers from, and you're kind of subservient to it, and it's going to replace your creativity and intelligence, then it's that, to me, that's not a productive way of thinking about it, because then you're missing the mark about what actual intelligence enables. So what I would offer is that instead of looking at these systems as they giving the correct answers and they can replace us, instead they're catalyzing our taste, our expression, our novelty. So I like to think of these systems as catalysts, as is another tool in our arsenal to be more creative. Um, and also removing some of those more mechanistic ways we need to accomplish in order to be creative, to express ourselves, right? So there's some sort of, I think the offloading aspect is also very important here. Um, so in a way, the same way I like to think about relaxed selection, which Terry, you've talked about in your work, the same way like a bird when it's out of, when it goes into captivity and it's not in nature, not imposed by sexual selection, then its songs become more creative, so because it's so this the same way I think about technology in general, and its purpose is to remove those mechanistic uh, constraints on our taste and creativity, so we could express ourselves better.
So in that respect, I'd be curious about creativity itself. Is this something we would say is this truly creativity? Um, and to some extent, this gets linked up with this concept of sentience, whether there's anybody there or not. Um, uh, you have you have just framed it in a way that it's partially there. So I'm kind of interested, first of all, if you think it's true creativity, or is it, as you've suggested, only a catalyst for our creativity? Or and also then finally, if we treat it one way or the other, what's the difference? If we say no, it's just a catalyst, then what's the consequence? If we say no, it's really creative and it's really doing its stuff uniquely and autonomously, what are the consequences?
The question of creativity is, the way I think about it, these static forms that exist in large language models. First of all, I think one thing that gets ignored is the action of prompting, right? Like, we prompt these models, and that's when then we get an output. They're not intrinsically by themselves going about the world and create it. So like, it's all, we're still putting it's the creativity and the insights still come from us, right? And the same, and the tricky thing is that you get something that looks more dynamic from AI, right? And I compare it to other technology. You can think about even like a piece of sheet music, like a music score, right? Even though it contains this sort of um, contains the compressed forms of actual music, but in a compressed space, until the musician comes and interprets these musical notes, there are no meaning. There's no meaning in the music score itself. And there's no information about timbre and acoustics and volume and like interpretation of phrases. None of that is in the music. And I think what LLMs have, they contain these sort of useful regularities of our expressions of our language and culture. And what's kind of misguiding here a little bit is that we kind of get the simulation of intelligence on top of that, where it then that's the pitfall that we say, okay, they might be actually intelligent, but what they have added on top of, I know the music score is kind of like a very, might be an odd example here, but what they've added on top of that process of compression is that they also do this recombination aspect very effortlessly, right? But we do that recombination anyways with something like a with music scores. We do theme and variations. There are like tricks in composition where we play the music backward and forward, we split it, right? But that recombination was very manual and took a long time for us to be creative with it. And this way, LLMs are even a better catalyst because they allow effortless and instantaneous recombination. But the creativity and the interpretation is still done by humans. What LLMs are doing, they're enabling this informational substrate for us to be more creative. So the fact that they're not the action of creativity is not intrinsic in these systems, the goals in them and all the constraints in them have come from us, and it's trained on our text and our language. So the only way it can be creative is relative to our creativity and interpretive process.
Let me raise a very specific example and see how you consider it. To the extent that large language models are trained using past and present interactions on the internet or whatever data set they use, um, I hypothesize that if artificial intelligence had been applied to the clothing industry in the 50s and 60s, we could have instantly gotten catalogs of every piece of clothing ever created, bought, sold, but we would never get the mini skirt. So I ask, true or false? Do you think if the AI at the level we have it now had been available back in the 50s and 60s, would we, if we depended on that AI, would we have ever gotten the mini skirt?
Good question. I think this is related to a concept that we talk about in the paper as well. Is it's a question of adjacent possibilities, right?
That
And
Stuart Kaufman's
yes, Stuart
concept. Yeah.
Kaufman's idea about evolvability. And I think what's interesting about that is, first of all, it states that any new thing, any novelty, comes out of recombination of the parts that are already there, and mixing and kind of sort of varying the parts that are already in that system. And I think what LLMs are affording us is that they've identified all these themes, all these principal components of our aesthetics.
In the example I've just given you, a critical parameter would be labeled, quote, skirt length.
Hmm.
You know,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
but prior to the miniskirt, that parameter ran from ankle to knee, didn't go above the knee. Uh, and so I start out in answering my own question saying, no, we would not have gotten the miniskirt. That took, I think of the world of artificial intelligence as being a little bit like the fashion industry without Fashion Week.
Mm,
Fashion Week is when all the weird new stuff happens.
right.
So if you have the fashion industry, the whole clothing industry without Fashion Week, that's AI for you. But then again, I counter myself and go to the example of AlphaGo, AlphaGo, and the famous Move 37 in its contest with the world champion, where it placed a stone, 5 rungs out from the edge, which was completely insane in the light of everything every Go master knew up to that time. But AlphaGo figured it out. It
Mhm.
came up with something really new in the game of Go. So, that leaves me
Mhm.
unsure
Right.
about whether AI could have come up with a miniskirt or not.
Basically, your question is, can it get out of the box?
Yeah,
The parameter point you raise is important. I think LLM, if you were to prompt it to generate as many variations as possible based on the clothing patterns, across cultures and across generations, the mini skirt would have probably been one of those, right? Right? The difference is that even though it generated that, it has to still go through our taste and aesthetics for it to become meaningful in society, right? Because probably many of those generations are ugly, right? No one would ever wear them, right? But the fact that the mini skirt was selected was because we liked it. I mean, as a society, there was some sort of aesthetic resonance there with society. So I think that's where we should distinguish. Yeah, of course it can generate variety, but it still has to go through our taste and our aesthetics to become meaningful.
I begin to see what you're saying, that AI could have produced the miniskirt, but it wouldn't have appreciated the miniskirt.
Yeah,
That takes a
exactly. And
horny
it wouldn't
guy.
have become it wouldn't have become a trend, unless people like it. That still goes back to our expression.
Uh-huh.
And of course, AlphaGo is different because that's just problem solving. That's where it's a little different there.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I think you're right. Yeah, I like that. So I want to go in a different direction now, and that is people are beginning to use it. We're all using these systems in various ways. Um, I would say over the next decades, we'll have generations of kids that are just buried in this stuff, constantly interacting, just like they do now with these various social apps and stuff. Now this is the maximum social app. It will always talk to you, always there to be your buddy, always there to give you advice. But this then leads us into this next question, and that is what you think AI is doing, whether you think somebody is there, whether you think it's creative, or whether you think it's just a chat bot, whether you think it's just a, a parrot, matters a lot. Um, Children, particularly growing up with this, are not going to have any of these comparisons. They're not going to be able to say, no, it's a little bit like that, or it's a little bit like this or that. This is going to be part of the general experience of being a child growing up in the next generation. Um,
Mhm.
I'm trying to get a sense of two things. Number one, how that will work out, what it will do to personality, to identity, to sociality um, for that generation. But then also, how you think of it will also matter. As if you think of this as your companion, as opposed to think of it as a tool, you treat it very differently and it will influence you very differently. Um, I'm kind of curious as to how you see this playing out in the next generation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the framing matters a lot here, especially for creativity. I mean, let's say you're interested in film, you're interested in music. If you get the sense, oh, there is this super intelligent being that does does things much better than I do and much faster, what's the point of me going to school and learning about film and music and art? The framing is very crucial here. If we frame it as, no, this is your taste and expression and aesthetics are still the primary driver of cultural evolution and change, and this is just to catalyze that. This is just to help you, it's just to aid you. Um, well, so that's, to me, the framing is crucial. And of course, I mean, there should be healthy ways of interacting with any technology. I mean, they can be super addictive, they can be harmful. You also think of them as more intelligent than you're intelligent, and you ask questions and take them for face value. I mean, there are all these issues that come with any new technology that we should navigate. But I think in terms of education, in terms of creativity, if we think of it as a catalyst, as this nice tutor person you always have with you that can guide you and make you more creative.
Can,
So,
can I want to throw in a challenge here. Uh, the way you've been talking about AI as um, enhancing rather than replacing us, um, I wonder whether you would respond to this issue. It seems to me what gets possibly overlooked in the stance you're taking is the degree to which AI is not just a tool, because it's like every other tool we human beings have ever invented, because all those other tools are means towards ends that we give them. There are ends. But now AI is distinguished by its ability to learn and reprogram itself and reprogram its own ends. So this is, as I'm sure you know, this is the classic, this is the alignment problem. Are AI's ends guaranteed to be in alignment with our ends, or are we setting something loose over which we have no control?
right. Well, I mean, the way I think about it is kind of like the technology that AI is, to me, similar to maybe like books, the invention of books, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because they are this sort of externalized system that contains our information. And
But
LLMs, uh-huh,
but a book cannot rewrite itself, can it?
sure, it cannot. So LLMs are in that sense, they're books but more abstract and ungrounded. Their their forms are even a step more further removed from our interpretive process. I mean, a book, a music score, it's still closer to the actual experience of music. I mean, you could, if you really delved into it, you could like see there are lines, and there's probably a relationship with pitch and things like that. AI, like, you wouldn't know anything if you looked at the zeros and ones in there. So it's, and that's why it's more powerful, because it's more abstracted and ungrounded. There's more possibility for generating novel outcome and being more spontaneous and things like that. And in terms of ends and goals, I don't think the system itself has any ends or goals.
Let,
It
let
just,
me let me pose a counterexample. Um, a heat guided missile.
right.
It's got ends. Now, then the question is, can it reprogram those ends? Well, this is what the Defense Department wants to use AI for. It wants to turn loose some machines that on their own can make the distinction: kill this guy and don't kill that guy.
That's right. But still, who we set the parameters, right? I mean, we prompted it
But
that.
yes, we do. But I mean, what I'm asking about is this capacity for the AI to reprogram itself, to reset those parameters itself.
Mm. I mean, but that would still be another parameter that we set, no? The
Well, that's
sort
the
of,
question. That's the question. I mean, I really am asking this sort of question. It seems to me that on the one hand, yeah, we want to say these days that AGI is a coming reality. It may already be here, and we don't recognize it. But once these things, well, I can go back to 50 years to a paper by a man named Good, who said, I'm sure you're familiar, the first machine mankind produces that is more intelligent than us, namely super intelligence, will be the last machine we ever design.
Hmm.
Because we will have projected this entity ahead of us in some kind of race towards whatever. Um, Now, I think that way of casting the problem makes an assumption that, again, needs challenging. I know what super strong means. Super strong, somebody can bench press a lot more than I can. It's a monotonic scale measured in pounds or kilograms. Then we hear this word super intelligence, and we imagine that we're looking at another monotonic scale and that these machines could get out ahead of us and render us useless OTOs, house pets, food, whatever. But I wonder whether the word super intelligence isn't more like the word super musical. Now, I don't think that's a monotonic scale, nor do I think super athletic is a monotonic scale, nor do I think that the term supernatural is a monotonic scale. So how do you react?
Right. I mean, so the way inspired by Terry that I've thought about these systems, they're simulation of
Mm,
intelligence, right?
mm,
But that doesn't mean simulation of intelligence cannot be powerful, right? I
right?
mean, if I actually create an AI robot and it's really intelligent and powerful, and press the button and be like, go invade that country, and goes and slaughters and invades. Yeah, it can do that. Doesn't mean it's has intentions and it has will, right? I still press the button and set the parameter. Like that's the technology I created, and it simulated powerful intelligence the same way you could send nukes and cause destruction. That's also technology. So to me, the effect is important. Of course, that's where the impact is. Yeah, in terms of effects, simulation of intelligence can be extremely destructive and powerful if used in the wrong way. So I think we're still finding ourselves with another technology that it has a lot of potential to have a lot of powerful effects. But still, to me, I still look at it as a simulation of
Mm,
intelligence, as still a
mhm.
technology that's inherently different than what's happening in organisms. But that doesn't mean it can't be powerful.
Now, I agree with you 100% on that, and I think Terry does too. That 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 just to admit that it is a simulation is not to denigrate its tremendous potential and its tremendous power. And these things,
Mhm.
I think we agree. Yeah, it's a simulation that the way the brain works is not the way a computer works. Um,
And I think and I think that's where I kind of go further with this because I try to then bridge this into an organic process
mm,
because I believe the debate usually ends here from what I've seen. Like there's one camp that says intelligent, there's another camp that says not intelligent, and the debate ends there. What I'm trying to maybe aim at here, which is inspired by the noosphere and the sort of this collective problem, is that maybe the simulation of intelligence is has an organic role even in organisms, and that's where I get into DNA and things like that. I think if you were to just get the patterns in DNA and just mindlessly create functions, right? That without the sort of cells guiding that process, it would be like a simulation of that
Mhm.
organic.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be it. So that's where I think this sort of this simulated low stake creativity world. That's how I see LLMs
D-
done by
talking
us.
with you,
That's
talking with you reminds me of the work of a very good friend of mine, a man named Alfonso Monturi, who is an editor of the journal World Futures. But he is also he teaches at CIIS. But he has been an editor of a 2-volume anthology titled "Social Creativity." I think if you don't know his work, you might find it very interesting because, like you, there's a real emphasis on creativity. What is it? Uh, is it just a now the phrase "just a" tips the hat already? Is it just a reshuffling of the same old stuff, or is it coming up with something genuinely new? And if so, what does genuinely new mean?
mm. No, that's a great. I mean, what I'm actually learning from this conversation is that maybe newness shouldn't be treated as creativity and novelty, because newness is not that difficult to create new things, right? If you combine anything, you could get new things. I think what then matters is that sort of aesthetic resonance, right? Whether
Uh,
this new thing actually has a meaningful function,
mhm.
meaningful end for the person that created it. So maybe that's a great point.
So let me start us off in a different direction, and that is we're now excited about these new ways of producing generative results. And it's moving from text to pictures to video and so on. It's getting more generic, more generalized, so that in that respect, it's general intelligence. Um, and of course, one of the challenges of intelligence, I always ask my students, how would we come up with an intelligence test for lots of different animals? So let's have an intelligence test for dolphins, an intelligence test for bats, an intelligence test for moles. The key is that their intelligences are adapted to very specific things. And we've up to this point been adapting them to very specific things. So one of the moves, of course, is this move towards, quote, general intelligence across the board. The key is that oftentimes what's intelligent in one context is not intelligent in another context. That intelligence is, to some extent, context sensitive. And what we're trying to do is, of course, create that. One of the questions I then have about our current situation, knowing that we are somewhere along a process of developing these systems, but we're not done yet. There's 20, 30, 40, 50 years ahead of us in which things are going to change. What are the current limitations? What things are going to change? And where should we be moving to change these things?
Great question. I think the sort of general intelligence aspect of it, which I think is also used differently across the. I've heard people use different. I mean, the way you're using it, general means across media or across different modalities. But I think the way I've heard about it is general intelligence means like actual intelligence, like it becomes actually it has selfhood. That's how I've heard the word intelligence used. But they're both interesting. And in terms of, I think you're right in terms of even like maybe translating across media. That's where, and it's sort of being more adapted to different circumstances, not just what they're designed for. Which LLMs actually they were a leap in that sense as well, because before that the AI community. There was a vision conference. There was a natural language processing conference. There were all these different, or an auditory AI. LLMs kind of consolidated all these fields and then treated everything as tokens and language. And that was, to me, that was the most profound change that happened in the machine learning community, that we could now treat everything as these abstract tokens and recombine them. So I think we're going to get even more of that. I think this what's already started is going to be even a more powerful translator and translate things live on the spot. That's where I think it's going.
So in all of this, there's a couple of directions also this stuff can go in. One is to make it more of a human interface. It anticipates our emotions, our needs, our wants, and that sort of thing. But the other direction, of course, and this has to do with who controls it, is that it can be manipulative. We already have all kinds of recommender systems and like and dislike systems and stuff like that that actually play a role in controlling our behavior, even though we don't know that it's happening. As things move in this direction, first of all, are either of these good or bad in and of themselves? How will we control that? How will we make sure that it's not actually something that will actually diminish us in some ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think in terms of first of all, in terms of the information in it, there could be a lot of biases in that. One company creates it with a bias. One country creates it with a different bias, and so that's the problem we've had in general. And these probably make it worse, because then you can separate the company from this intelligent being that knows everything. So it's even another cover for this sort of manipulative acts, and it can be very dangerous. And I think in general, again, going back to whether they're actually intelligent or if they know everything and we should just treat them as oracles, if we treat them as just another point of view, it's just another point of view. If you use Chinese LLM versus American LLM versus OpenAI versus Grok, there are different points of views on our cultural dimension and knowledge, and they just should be viewed that way. And those biases, the same way when you read news, you go check their about page to see if they're valid. That's what we've been trained to do as a society, to check our sources and make sure. Same way, if you're using an LLM, you have to know what company's making it, what their intentions are, and always have that skeptical view when you're using them. And again, to know that they're there to serve you and your purpose.
From this perspective, can we use AIs to check other AIs? Is that the way to deal with this? So for example, the AlphaGo was trained as a sort of against itself. It was competing with itself. And one of the things that we've done in various editing issues, we have it produce something and say, now tell me what's wrong with that. Now, the key is, even though we're asking the same AI, it has no memory of what it just did. So it looks at it as something brand new and now critiques it. Is it possible that we can begin to use AI to correct for some of the biases of AI? That is, can you, like using one company to check what another company is doing, you use Grok to check on the references that OpenAI produces, that sort of thing. Is that a possible future scenario for keeping it under control? Not that we control it, but that we use AI to control AI.
That's a great idea. I think, the sort of this generative movement of neural networks start with the models or an algorithm called generative adversarial network GANs, and that's what they did. They would sort of there was one neural network that would compete with the other one and trying to deceive it, and as a result of that, it kept getting better. Of course, reinforcement learning used a similar concept, kept competing with itself. But now you're saying instead of even like within model competition, we should have a cross model competition. I think that's a great idea. I think that could be an extension of wisdom of the crowd idea that we have with humans, And again, with the news, you check 5 news sources and 4 of them are saying this happened, one of them is saying it's not, you of course go with the 4 networks that are seeing the same. So I think, and the fact that if one, I mean, I heard that the sort of the DeepSeek, the Chinese large language model, it was like denying things about politics or that actually happened. So if a person's using that and 10 other large language models are saying that historical event actually did happen, then if you have a system that could get the wisdom of the crowd of these models, then you could get an answer that's probabilistically more correct. So I think that makes sense to me.
You're going to want to ask a bunch of different models to tell you about Tiananmen Square. And DeepSeek is going to be an outlier as
Mm.
opposed to what the other models tell you about Tiananmen Square.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this is really about, what is the motivation or intention or directionality behind each of these creations. One of the things that's quite clear is that you and I by ourselves can't create one of these, in part because it requires incredible compute power, eats a lot of energy, and takes a lot of money to do this. And so yes, governments, maybe defense departments, certainly very big corporations, all of these can run it. So that, obviously, X and Meta and Microsoft, and OpenAI, all of these can produce these systems. But this basically says that there's an interesting asymmetry here, an asymmetry in terms of the haves and have-nots, in terms of those in power and those without power, in terms of the first world versus the third world. What are the consequences of that asymmetry?
With a lot of there's already, I think, a lot of asymmetrical technology. I mean, nobody can produce bombs and weapons or build large media network like CNN or Fox News, or so this sort of the fact that we can't create this is also another one of those asymmetrical aspects of technology that can be replicated by an individual. Only like large entity or space exploration, for example, nobody can just go to space on their own or build a car even. So I think, and that's where the importance of even more social discussion and collaboration to make sure we put these institutions in check, right? The same way we've been doing it. So I think politics is very important. I mean, the sort of lobbying and politics, the sort of the whole this whole cultural, social, political process we've had is even more crucial than ever now with a system like this.
So this actually leads me to this a final question on this topic, which is, okay, so here we're moving into this, without really knowing what we're doing yet. And it's going to be used by the general public, everyone, to some extent. what do we need to educate the world about, educate the average user about? What do they need to know so that we don't get into trouble?
Hmm.
It's about, exactly what we're doing here. We're trying to educate ourselves as well as the rest of the public about what needs to be known about this stuff. Well, what does need to be known? What do the general public need to know about this in order to
Hmm.
keep it from being problematic?
I think the intelligence issue, to me, that's the most important. The framing of whether it's intelligent or not, that's very important, I think. Like, a lot of people are using it for therapy purposes or medical advice, to get medical advice, or a lot of kids are using to do their homework. I mean, this sort of the wrong ways it can be used in, if you treat it as this intelligent oracle that can do things for you, it can replace humans. If you believe that, then that's really problematic. If instead the framing would be that these are assistants for your intelligence, for your creativity. If you already have an insight, an idea, if you already have a vision, if you only get some help to facilitate that, that's the healthy relationship you can have with these models. So I think the framing of intelligence is important, and regulations. I would say one thing that's also really crucial here is the concept Jaron Lanier talks about, data dignity. I mean, we've never had, I mean, in terms of regulations we have for copyright and fair use and things like that, we've never thought about a system that could just crawl all knowledge and use it. I mean, because that was never an option, we never set laws to regulate it. So the fact that I can put an article out there on my blog, and OpenAI comes, eats it up, and then trains its models, and then charges its users $20 a month, and I didn't get anything out of that. So that's, to me, that's a problem, right? So I think there should be ways to compensate every bit of data that someone contributed. Otherwise, people are going to get discouraged and not even be creative or contribute. Why would I create something if I know it's going to be used by an entity that doesn't um, compensate me? So, and that ties to also creativity, to put the importance on the an individual, that their creativity actually enriches these models. So they're the primary fuel of this technology, not the other way around, because there's this uh, there's this talk about synthetic data, like training AI models on its own outputs. I think that's very dangerous. The way I think about it is, I mean, if you think about it in terms of compression, it could make these compression artifacts, it could amplify them. Ted Chiang talks about it. It could make the internet even blurrier than what it is, and cause a sort of what I call aesthetic drift in our society in terms of what outputs we're getting out of these systems. So I think, again, what's crucial there is our that it goes through our filter, our aesthetic filter, and that's when you could get meaningful contributions in culture. Like, you get mini skirts, like the way we're talking about it. That's useful. Yeah, so that's where I would put the focus. The reframing, I think, is crucial, and it can have consequences that we can't even, like, understand now. But if you reframe it and people understand that people are still the curators of knowledge and creativity, and these systems are just there to facilitate and catalyze that'd be crucial.
So I actually see a role of AI training people about AI. Um, you know, in effect, just like it's a great source for teaching, many subjects and sort of getting in line with where someone's knowledge actually is and knowing how to augment that background to catalyze the learning process. It could easily be a good tool for, whenever you interact with it, helping you understand what it does and doesn't do, what it is and isn't. I think AI in that role could play a very significant role in helping people understand how to use it and how not to abuse it. So I think that's a crucial part of it as well. So we had a last question. Jay, and usually ask this question.
Oh, yeah, sure. But before I do ask that question, I want to sort of provoke where we are now about, how to use AI and what our relationship to it is. And 4 or 5 years ago, our citizen diplomacy project ran a conference in St. Petersburg with students from the United States and students from Russia. And the question of the conference was, whom do you trust? Got to get the M on there on the who. Whom do or we say, who do you trust? Well, this is the issue we're talking about with AI. What people need to know about AI is that they can't trust it completely. AI can screw up. AI can make mistakes. So people need to know. But anyway, the question that Terry was referring to that we like to close with was getting you to do our work for us. In other words, what question did we not ask you that we should have asked you? Is there something on your mind that we just haven't gotten to?
I think one aspect that also I mean, I think we covered a lot about creativity and things like that. I think one aspect that we could also touch on is problem solving and what these tools might enable in terms of the more global issues we have, right? That seems so daunting to us. Climate change, for example, we have this.
Little thing
Mhm.
like world peace.
Exactly, exactly, yeah. And what role could a system like this enable for us? And I mean, we talked about creativity and like the sort of recombination um, angle that these systems are really good for recombination. And of course, I would say in terms of decision making, the the Western world has a very specific bias in how to go about things and how to solve problems. And of course, our LLMs are also biased in terms of the information they have. They mostly have English and Western bias in them. I would say there's probably a lot of wisdom in different cultures and communities and generations on how to solve problems. But that's not in our conversation. That's not in our research necessarily. One thing that LLMs could help us with, because they crawl, they could crawl, because they have access to all knowledge across cultures and generations, they could give us insights that we could have not seen before. Like something that an Eastern philosopher said in 12th century, or a piece of knowledge that's very, very active in a tribe in Africa, or something in Greek mythology. Like there are all these sort of different bits and pieces of insight and knowledge and wisdom that we've accumulated, but it's been blocked by this sort of the latest computational technological bias that we currently have. I think AI as a catalyst that we talked about could kind of open up that possibility space and let us see this accumulation knowledge and be able to solve problems that are daunting
I
that we
think
have.
I think
Like,
you're directing us towards these cultural issues, and that it's not just United States and China and Russia, but there are a bunch of other cultures in the world. Maybe they have something to tell us. I'm reminded of the phrase that's really been pretty current in 20th and 21st century philosophy, the phrase human flourishing. What what does human flourishing really mean? Well, our different cultures have some different answers to that. Uh, One man's success may be another's failure.
One of the things and this is shifting to another topic that we could maybe leave it for another time. But let me just ask this: I know that you've been very much interested in this problem of catastrophic forgetting, and this problem, in a sense, was resolved with the LLM world by simply not retraining. Give one training cycle, give it a lot of information, dump a lot of stuff in there, but don't rewrite it with new training, with new information. Don't get it to learn anything new. So one of the challenges we have, of course, is each of these systems has a kind of a retrospective sense, and as a result, they're not adaptive in the same sense. That is, they don't learn new stuff.
Terry, Terry, what you're saying, it reminds me so much of one of Stuart Brand's wonderful gnomic sayings. He says, "How do you want to become rich and famous? Have one good idea and never have another."
Yeah.
I mean,
So
that's
yeah, the real challenge here is that to some extent, um, they're not adaptive. And I see this in a couple of ways. One is that these are, quote, prediction machines. Um, and they're making predictions on the statistics of what they've been trained on, and using the prompt to sort of bias that statistical prediction. But a prediction usually gets tested. When I have a hypothesis about what to do in the world, how to accomplish something, I then have to encounter the actual world. And if my prediction is not so good, if my prediction is not sort of based on what's out in the world, things don't go so well. These systems don't have that part of it. That is because they have been trained in a way that is not constantly updated and adaptive. Um, they are not testing themselves. The You might say the purpose, if we want to put it this way, even though the purpose is extrinsically applied, the purpose is just to make a prediction on the statistics I have. It's not to find out what's true. It's not to find out what works. Um, these are things that intelligence is about. That's what an animal does. It predicts what's going on in the world in order to see if it works, in order to accomplish something. These systems are not doing that. They don't have that last cycle, which has to do with adaptation, has to do with being in the world. These are systems that are not in the world. Um,
has to do with self-correcting.
that's right. That's right. So one of the reasons that these systems do what we sometimes describe as hallucinate is that there's no interest in finding out what's right or true or best suited for the context. They're about predicting from the statistical model that I have what's likely to follow from this statistical model. Um, that's something different than what intelligence is. And we have not really quite put that into the story. And in part, one of the questions I have is that will we need a totally different kind of model than the LLM generative models? These are models that are based upon prediction from the statistical model I have, but they're not about getting at what the world is like, what's true, what's useful, and so on and so forth. That's not built into this at all. This is, of course, what people are providing now, and people can provide, but not if they forget that part of what the LLM is doing.
The way I view kind of the organismal intelligence is that the intelligence comes out of biological autonomic processes that are already there to help the organism survive. The work you've done, Terry, to kind of explore that is, yeah, in a sense, the intelligence is not separate from the living process. So you can't afford to do something that would go against its survival, because the processes and principles are aiding intelligence are this probably the extensions or expansions of the same processes that are helping the organism repair and survive. And I mean, and the catastrophic forgetting issue is, I think you're pointing to the right direction here, is because the problem came about when people started training digits from 1 to 9. It would start with training 1, 2, 3, 4, and by the time it would see nines, it would forget about the ones, and it couldn't predict the ones. And of course, that's not how organisms learn, and it's not just series of tasks, like, and the organism couldn't afford to forget that one was important by the time it gets to 9, if actually had a role in its survival and reproduction. So I think and I mean, the question that I have that I don't have an answer to now is, we sort of, I mean, I have separated what the LLMs are doing from the sort of organismal intelligence, right? And I think that's a different science. And I think it's a very valid science, and we could explore how to embed these processes that are already in organisms with silicon, and like with a sort of in an actual artificial intelligence. So I don't know if LLMs need to necessarily go that way to serve the purpose that they've started to serve. I don't know if that's necessary for this sort of this model, this science that LLMs have.
Yeah. So my question is mostly about um, another kind of architecture. Do we need another kind of architecture? We've been really excited by this particular architecture, but it was precisely created to some extent to avoid the problem of catastrophic forgetting. But precisely because that's how it was designed, it doesn't do certain things. It doesn't adapt. It's not interested in what's true, what works. It's just a prediction from what it's got.
And prediction, the way I'd put it, Terry, is what you're showing us, what you're telling us, is that a prediction machine, which can produce an answer of what is most likely, may not be the answer that is best. I'm reminded of one description, having in early in life been surrounded with academics when I was teaching philosophy. Um, my ex-wife used to talk about so many of my friends who she would call smart in books and dumb in life.
One thing that comes to mind from, I mean, your question is, you were kind of linking the information processing to survival and the sort of the intrinsic needs of the organism. And I think one thing that LLMs lack is that they're not getting any input from our emotions and our arousal state and our needs, and the sort of gut feeling. Like we see a picture and we're like, oh, we gasp. Like they don't know anything about how we react.
Well, but now this is the fascinating thing, though. In fact, we do have artificial intelligence eye trackers, face trackers that can be hypersensitive to emotions And this is what I find the paradoxical aspect. They can be hypersensitive to emotions and then turn around and say to you, but I'm not really feeling this emotion. I'm just telling you what I've heard about it.
Right. Yeah. In terms of language, I mean, I'll use a crazy example here. Let's say you have a music score for Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and the goal is to recreate that symphony closest to how Beethoven saw it. If you had Beethoven's heartbeat on top of the music scores, right? You could actually be like, okay, this is a forte here. Okay, that's a pianissimo. Or you could actually have some clues about Beethoven's emotional state. Then you could probably recreate a more authentic Fifth Symphony. And like this, that's the same way I think about the question you raised, Terry, if these LLMs could be even more in tune with our how we feel, because now it's culture is a little different than when you think about organismal survival. Now it's about sort of cultural flourishing and evolvability in that sense. Then if these systems had more information about how we feel, not just what we express through language, because language is very compressed and cuts a lot of that. If we had more information about the context of our living being behind these creations, I think that could lead the way to a better architecture that could have a sense of our emotional states on top of our language outputs.